everything on schedule. Why don't I throw it to Jessie and she can introduce her speaker?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I would like to introduce our speaker, Christine Deaver. She is the Special Education Coordinator at Jamestown Public Schools, and she is an experienced behavior analyst who also taught me a lot of what I know. So we are very grateful to have her here presenting to us.
Thank you. I am notorious for overwhelming people with information. My goal is not to do that to you, but just to provide enough information that if you want to follow up with additional information, send me an email. I'll load you up with information or resources. But we'll start off with just some information on some significant behavior problems, specifically interventions and triggers, factors that would impact self-interest behavior, as well as some strategies or techniques for de-escalating situations that may lead to that self-interest behavior. And then we'll also talk about some tools or ways of assessing the environment to possibly determine the cause of self-interest behavior. So one of the first things, and this is something I thought about as I was trying to sleep last night, which I wasn't really doing a whole lot of. But what are some of the characteristics of the learner that we should be thinking about? Because it's kind of important to know what are their skills, skill deficits, skill strengths, as well as their interests, health, and how that might play out with the impact between health and behavior problems, play or leisure skills, what our learning environment looks like, whether that is as an adult, I'm still a learner. What does that look like for me as I come to work and I'm learning something new, or as I'm going out and consulting in kindergarten or 7th or 8th grade or whatever it might be. But how does that learning environment impact my skills, whether that's behavior problems or adaptive behaviors? How does instruction help or influence behaviors? Again, positive or negative behaviors. And then what are some resources I might have at my disposal at home and family? What kind of environments do I go out to? How do those outings influence my skill set? And just in some ways, think of your language and how that's impacted by your vacations and the hobbies you engage in. Those things that you frequently tap into as reinforcers, as well as friends. What are some of those shared interests, activities? Not only does all of this kind of play a role in who I am as a person or a learner, but that also plays a role in my behaviors, whether that's adaptive behavior skills or problematic behaviors. So I kind of like to get an idea of what kind of a learner are we talking about when we start thinking about self-interest behavior. Because it could be, for example, a student who has an emotional disturbance. So maybe cognitively we are average to above average, but we still have some behaviors that are self-interest, some cutting or things like that. Or are we a individual who has maybe intellectual disability or autism? And so how we communicate might influence our behaviors, or maybe we misunderstand a lot of that communication, and how does that play a role or impact our behavior? So characteristics of the learner are pretty important as we're determining goals, as we're possibly thinking about target behaviors. What am I going to target for a behavior plan, or for if you're on an IEP, for goals? And then the next thing I really started thinking about was, we're pretty good at identifying target behaviors for goals, maybe for reading, whether that's a decoding, knowing your letters have sounds, what sounds do they make, putting them together, reading words. But then there's some behavior problems that people engage in. And sometimes it's a social skill deficit. Like I might not know how to appropriately greet Jessie. And so maybe I'm greeting her like 100 times a day. And she's like, Chris, you said that at 8 o'clock and now it is 3:30. You don't have to greet me again. So again, that social skill, how do we identify what those target behaviors might be? And, there's some target behaviors like me greeting people too often during the day. Well, that's kind of a small social behavior that I might want to address. But then there's some other behaviors, like how do we prioritize the behaviors that we're going to address? And how is self-interest behavior different from other target behaviors? And some of the things that I laid awake last night shortly thinking about were some of the behaviors, for example, the social skills, while they might be annoying and disruptive, they really don't cause any physical harm to anyone. And self-injurious behavior rises to that level that we might need medical care, depending on what type of self-interest behavior. So as I thought about that, then there are some things that we need to be thoughtful about, and that is that influence. And sometimes it's a definite medical condition that causes target behaviors or some self-interest behavior. For example, years ago, I had a student I consulted with that he did a lot of nose picking, and he would pick his nose, and at first, that's just a social thing, like, that's gross, go wash your hands, you're spreading germs, don't do that. Turned out he had a tumor growing up in his nose, and it was really pressing on the nasal cavity, and it was really uncomfortable. So the picking in the nose was problematic, but it was really a medical issue that obviously you take care of that, and then the nose picking went down. So there are some self-interest behaviors that are more medically presented, or we need to address it through medical, whether that's genetic disorder, biological, physical. Maybe you're uncomfortable. Some individuals might engage in problem behaviors when they have a physical illness. For example, little babies, when they start pulling on that ear, our first thought is, do they have ear infection? Well, as you're really little, this could easily become shaped into the head banging. So we want to make sure we're really ruling out that medical piece. Again, self-interest behavior can also be through learning. Again, think of that little baby who's been pulling on their ear. Well, what happens when it's, again, medical to start with, they pull on that ear, but mom comes or caregiver comes, and we provide lots of love and interaction and comfort because you're just not feeling well. And over time, this can be through learning associated with comfort. So if I do this and start on the head banging, adults come and they care for the young baby. And so some learning could also happen, and that what was a medical thing, that ear infection, has now become also a learned behavior for, that's how I get some care and assistance. Another example, medical condition is maybe constipation. Well, constipation could be because of some medical things. Maybe my GI tract, on the way as excrement leaves the body, maybe that's the colon or the large and small intestines might be blocked in some way. Maybe they're not the right size, or there's some obstruction. So that might be a medical issue. But it can also be things like, I didn't have enough fruits and vegetables and water, and so the food doesn't move through the system correctly. And so there could be some learned behavior. I don't like to eat those things. I don't drink enough. So the waste and byproducts don't move through. And so it's kind of sometimes a little complicated. Is it really just medical? Is it really just learning? Or for some, it's a combination of the two, where it's a little bit of medical and a little bit of learning. And so that intervention needs to be both. We need to address the medical, because it would be unethical to use just behavioral interventions for a medical condition. We need to address that medical piece. But, for example, with the eating problems and the blockage, it gets really uncomfortable to eat right because it hurts to use the bathroom then. So now I've learned I really don't want to eat too much, because then when I go to the bathroom, it hurts. And so it becomes a vicious cycle. And so you need to address both the medical piece and that social learning piece. So as we get into behaviors, and I'm sure you've heard about the 4 functions of behaviors before. We know that behavior can be automatic, meaning engaging in that behavior feels good. For example, sometimes we enjoy certain things to smell. I might really enjoy smelling a specific flower. So I might engage in behaviors that seem unusual because I want to smell that wonderful bouquet of flowers on your desk. Years ago, I had a student who liked to smell my hair. Apparently, it was a really nice scented hairspray, which when I figured that that's why he was getting into my space and smelling me all the time, I just changed hairspray. And then he quit smelling me. But that automatic or sensory function can also be to make something that is uncomfortable quit. For example, if you have a mosquito bite and it itches when you scratch it temporarily, it no longer itches. So we might engage in behavior because it relieves some sort of aversive situation. Again, going back to my previous example, that baby who pulled on their ear and then was eventually had, banging their ear. That was a medical condition. It hurt. And when you pull on your ear just a little bit, sometimes it relieves some of that pressure on your eardrum and it feels good, but it's momentarily. So automatic sensory is one of the functions. Another is escape. I don't want to do this. Whether that's a task, maybe I don't want to go in that environment. It's not fun. It's really overwhelming. It's loud. It's crazy, funky smells. It could be I don't want to work with you because for whatever reason you remind me of someone I don't like, or you're really loud and I'm kind of a quiet person. I might avoid certain things or try to get out of certain things because of a sound. Could be for lighting, could be again that task, that homework or a chore. I don't want to do it. Another function of behavior is attention. I want attention. Could be, I've worked alone a lot and it's been like 6 hours, so now I get to hang out with people and so I'm really excited to get your attention. But sometimes for little ones or those who might not have great communication skills, any attention is better than no attention. So if no one's attended to me for a while, if I quickly hit someone, chances are we're going to come over and intervene. So I got your attention. To me, it really didn't matter. It was just easier to do that. Now you're reprimanding me, but I got your attention. Then I've been good all day and you've kind of ignored me. And so that attention can definitely be a function of behavior. And the fourth function is tangible. I want something. Now that something could be, I want a specific person. It could be, I need a snack. It could be, I want the gym because that's where all the fun things happen. It could be an item. I want the red shovel. And specifically the red shovel. So it could be, I want something. So that item, it could be a specific activity. So those are kind of the reasons why we engage in behavior problems. So I'm going to walk us through a little bit more concretely those functions. So attention, why I might engage in behavior might be because this is how I've learned to get attention. For example, I throw items or materials across the room when no one's attending me, and that's when people come and provide attention. I might yell at other kids to get them to come over and then I get reprimanded. Could be I go to the bathroom in my pants, and that obviously we're not going to let someone sit there in soiled clothes. So when I do that, someone comes over, they provide one-on-one attention to me while I'm getting cleaned up, new clothes. It could also be I hit myself and everyone kind of stops what they're doing and they console me because it really is uncomfortable when people are hurting themselves. So again, hitting oneself could be attention. Escape, again, we might try to escape, avoid, delay certain tasks. So again, the examples, throwing toys across the room lets me play with the toys longer because now you have me go and pick them up and now I throw them again. And so it's this vicious cycle that I'm told to pick up the toys, I throw them, I go over there to pick them up, I throw them. So I'm delaying that, putting the toys away and moving on to that next activity. Again, yelling at other kids gets me additional time to stay in the gym, an activity that I might not like. So if I yell, I don't have to go to gym time. If I yell, chances are, Chris, you were so disruptive. You don't get whatever that next fun activity might be. Going to the bathroom in my pants usually we're not going to, get freshened right in the middle of the classroom. So if I go in the bathroom with my pants, I get out of the classroom, might not have to do that task, it might be uninteresting, boring, or for whatever reason, I just didn't like that room. Again, hitting myself. When this happens, chances are we console, but you also probably remove that task because no one wants, you to, I'm not going to prompt you through, usually. Most people aren't going to prompt you through, finish this, and then you get a break. But we've noticed that when you hit, when we remove this, you stop. So escape might be the reason. Could also be, again, we get stuff. Throwing materials across the room might result in I get different items. Oh, you didn't like that? What about this one? Oh, you didn't like that one either? How about this one? Yelling, again, could result in people coming over, soothing me. We can get a pat on the back, we might get a back rub, a hug, something of that nature. Going to the bathroom in our pants. I get out of these clothes and I know my mom have my favorite sweats. And so I don't like my jeans. If I go to the bathroom in my pants, I get the sweatpants instead of the jeans. Or hitting myself results in you putting protective mitts on my hands or maybe a helmet on my head. So again, I get some tangibles there. And then sensory, this one focuses most on the access to rather than the avoidance of, but throwing items, sometimes it sounds pretty cool to hear things rattle off walls and kind of rumble around on the floor. And kids laugh. Isn't that fun to hear that sound too? Especially if I don't have a way of making a lot of other things happen in my environment. Doing that gets a big cause and effect thing to happen. Could also be for some, if I yell, you get to feel those sounds being made, but you also get to hear it reverberate off the walls in whatever environment you're on. And sometimes for some kids, that's pretty exciting to learn that. Going to the bathroom in your pants, depending on, especially in North Dakota, if you were just outside and it was 30 below, boy, you're cold. You come inside, you wet yourself. Ooh, that is body temperature. That's going to be warm. And depending on what happens, you might get a shower, which is probably going to be, temperature adjusted to make sure it's warm as well. So if you're cold, that might be a way to access some warmth. Or again, the hitting yourself could result in that release, which does result in that release of the neurotransmitters. It's kind of that runner's high. So sometimes engaging in those self-interest behaviors results in that. So as you saw, the 4 examples I used were the same 4 behaviors for each of the functions. And so again, those the reasons why we might behave are sensory, escape, attention, tangible. Just a little caveat is that as we think about functions of behavior, from my experience working in a lot of schools, when kids and students, learners engage in problem behavior, we usually jump to sensory interventions. And I'm not going to say that that's a bad thing. I'm just thinking that we should probably be thoughtful about that because there are 3 other functions. And then when I go to the research, and I'm kind of a research nut, so I apologize. I don't want to bore you too much, but there have been some wonderful, well-done research studies that have looked at functional behavior assessments and functional analyses. And when they dive into that research, and they're meta-analyses, when they've dove into that research, what they find is that sensory function is probably the primary function of behavior only about 16 to 17% of the time. So if our first intervention sensory, we're probably wrong about 83% of the time. So we might need to be thoughtful and look at what are those social functions? What are the other things that other people do in our environment to reinforce that behavior? Now, there are some functions where it's escape and sensory, or it's attention and sensory. But if our go-to intervention is solely sensory, we're probably not going to have the best, most effective intervention to begin with. So we might want to think of those other functions as well. Now, how does this all relate? Well, in some ways, it all looks the same, doesn't it? I use the same 4 examples for behavior for each one of those functions. Well, it's kind of up to us then to be more like detectives and try to figure out what's the context, what's going on right before that behavior happens, and what's a typical response, because those are the things that let us know what's most likely to be the function and how might we be able to prevent some things. What skills should we possibly be teaching so that the person can have a better way of getting their needs met? So some of the things we could do is just ask ourselves some questions. We're not sure. Well, what's the one thing you could do to get this behavior to stop? Is it providing access to something? Is it to remove something? What happens if we just kind of leave the person alone a little bit? What impact does that have on behavior? If we're not sure, collect some more data. What's the context in which the behavior happens the most frequent? Is there a particular time of day? Is there a particular environment or subject matter or context that's related to more behavior or less behavior? And again, some behaviors serve multiple functions. Maybe it started, again, the little baby pulling on the ear for the ear infection. It started off as a medical automatic negative function. And over time, the baby learned I do this, and I also get a lot of comfort and attention from my mom. So it may start as one function and kind of continue and evolve and turn into another function. So what's important? Again, I already talked a little bit about those antecedents. What happens before the behaviors really lets us know, for example, escape. If most behavior problems occur after Chris presents a request to do a task, most likely, not all the time, most likely the purpose is escape. Then we can adjust our intervention that way. If it's Chris has been sitting at her desk working away for 20 minutes and no one's really interacted with us, we might think that maybe attention might be a little bit of a motivator now or a reinforcer. So what happens before the behavior sometimes is just as important, if not more important, than the actual behavior that person is engaging in. The behavior of interest is anything that that person says, thinks, or does that is of interest to us, whether it's a skill we want to or behavior we'd like to teach and increase, or something that we're seeing that, this really isn't going to be beneficial for them down the road. As an adult, that won't be what most people in society are going to see as successful adaptive skills or social skills. So it helps us identify maybe some targets for teaching. And then the consequences. And I use the word consequence not as discipline, but simply as what typically follows the behavior. Is it that we do come in and provide some consolation if someone's crying? Is it that we give them some attention? Is it that we're patting their back and trying to help soothe them? Is it that, boy, Chris, you've been working really hard and here, why don't you take a break? We're providing that opportunity. What's important for us is to think in terms of, what does this person prefer? What are some of their interests? Not what I think is important or what they might like, but what they think is preferred. An example, I like chocolate. I really like chocolate. My sister doesn't. And so if you provide my sister some chocolate after she worked really hard on a paper, she's probably not going to work as hard on writing papers anymore because she doesn't like chocolate. Whereas if you did that for me, I'm probably going to do it again because I like chocolate. Nothing wrong with chocolate. It's just knowing what that person prefers. The other thing we need to think about is, how much work do I have to do to receive that chocolate? Again, I really like chocolate. I'm not running a marathon for chocolate. Nothing wrong with chocolate. I still like it. It's just that's a lot of work and a lot of time. If I'm going to run a marathon, I don't think a piece of chocolate is really going to do it. Now, if you said my children's life depended on it, I'm going to run that marathon because they really are very dear to me. I might not have the best time at it, but I really, really love my kids. So We talked a little bit there about preferences and reinforcers. Reinforcers are those things that following behavior really increase the likelihood that that behavior is going to happen in the future. And if it's a piece of chocolate, but it didn't change my behavior, it wasn't a reinforcer. It was just a really nice thing you did, wasn't a reinforcer. For reinforcers, some things to think about are, how do we make them distinct? Meaning, how does this thing that follows the behavior stand out from how we typically respond? Because if it doesn't stand out, I might not notice that that was supposed to be a reinforcer. We want to pair it with descriptive social interactions like, hey, Chris, you did a really nice job getting your homework done, and now you've got a great presentation ready for you to provide. It shouldn't be just good job, good job, good job, good job. Hey, way to go, way to go, way to go, way to go. It needs to be descriptive so that if we are using tangibles, we might be able to fade those back into something that's more social in nature. Reinforcers are most effective when they're immediate. They immediately or as close in time occur following that behavior. They're preferred. Again, I like chocolate, my sister doesn't. We also need to make it varied. And while I like chocolate, if I just had 2 big candy bars, chances are that I'm not going to work very hard for that third. So you might need to vary it up a little bit. We also, and I alluded to this already, we need to make sure that the response effort, how much behavior do I have to do to get it, kind of matches that reinforcer. I like chocolate. I'm not going to run a marathon for 1 piece of chocolate. We also need to look at quality of reinforcers. I know a lot of gamers. They love to game, and we might be able to use some gaming time as reinforcer. They're not going to work very hard for 2 minutes of a game. Most gamers, they'd rather have maybe a token economy where they can add up to 10 or 15, 20 minutes of gaming time, because 2 minutes, I barely get logged in and I have to put it away again. So we need to think about that quality of the reinforcer and the rate of reinforcement. When we talk about rate, that's how frequently that behavior is getting reinforced. How much work do I have to do to get that? Is it just a little bit? Is it predictable reinforcement, or kind of varied? There are different methods for collecting data. Again, as we're thinking of those self-interest behaviors, some things we might do or look at indirect assessments. And those are things that are historical documents of some sort we can review to look at, well, what is Chris's past history of this problem behavior? Because the best predictor of future behavior is our past behavior. So let's review those records. There might be some rating scales, adaptive rating scales. We can talk with people who know Chris really well so they can give us information about Chris and her background and her social skills and her adaptive skills and maybe communication skills. Those are really important. We might do some direct assessments, and those would be some either anecdotal recording. So we're observing in real time with a natural environment to look and see what happens before and after those behaviors to get us an idea of what's the function, what's the environmental context. We may also use scatter plot, which I've done a lot lately. And a scatter plot just kind of breaks the day down into increments, and we indicate whether or not the behavior happened during that time or how much behavior happened during that time. And you can start to see a pattern. For example, maybe Chris engages in more chatting with her neighbors at 9 o'clock than she does at 1, because she's had to be quiet since 8 o'clock, whereas at 1 o'clock, she just came back from lunch and was able to socialize. So now she's not seeking that attention as much. So that directed assessment is looking at it in the natural environment to gather information. And the functional analysis is when we strategically alter consequences just to see what the impact has on that behavior. So it's not just taking someone's word at it, but really trying something different and collect data and see, did it make a difference? What impact did it have? Of the 3 methods, the indirect usually helps me define or better describe what that target behavior might look like so that you and I could both collect data and say it happened or it didn't. That direct assessment allows us to decide how big of a problem is it really? Is it improving or not? And that functional analysis allows us to really look at what's the purpose behind that. Contextual fit. This is important because I can write a darn good behavior plan, but if it doesn't fit with the characteristics of that learner and for the context, no one's going to implement it. It's not going to be effective. So I really need to think about what are the skills that this learner has, because if I'm going to teach an alternative or a replacement behavior, they have to be able to actually perform that replacement behavior. And then who's in the environment and what will be reasonable and doable for a behavior plan in that context. Because if it's not reasonable and doable, it's kind of a waste of time to write it down. And then what are the features of the environment or the systems within which that plan will be implemented? Do we train everyone? Do they have the resources to implement the plan? So something to think about. So as we think about our interventions, again, based on our learner characteristics, based on the significance of this behavior, some common antecedents, and those antecedents, while we collect it for behavior assessment purposes, we're really using those to help us with the intervention. So the antecedent, that allows us to think prevention. What am I going to do to prevent and be proactive as much as possible? So we might be using some visuals. We might provide clear expectations and rules. And those are important, for example, as if everyone travels via airplane, they have those monitors up everywhere for you to, when you get to the airport, you can look and see, oh, I'm flying out of gate 2 or A3. They don't wait until Chris misses her flight and then puts up the monitor for Chris to read. It's there to prevent me from missing my flight. And so some of those antecedents are there to prevent and be proactive. So visuals, clear expectations and rules. We also, again, for collecting data to help us, those, as we're doing that, hopefully we can pick up on some environmental triggers. We might notice at my example earlier, that young man who used to smell my hair. What are those environmental triggers? Well, for that particular person, it was in band. So I was already trying to help with hand over hand, teaching him how to hit the drum to the beat. So we're already in close proximity. And then it must have been the smell. And so that was the trigger. I'm like, how can I change this? So again, I just, on my own, changed my hairspray, no longer scented. He wasn't as interested in getting quite so close and smelling. We can also use those antecedents to start looking for a chain of behavior. Oftentimes behaviors might look fairly, start with, for example, not doing it, I say, somehow I verbally refuse, I push away, I might cross my arms, make my arms harder to get for a hand over hand kind of prompt. And if the staff continues to prompt, it's possible I might stand up, topple over a chair, throw something, start banging my head, and then we stop. Well, if that happens, we're going to look for those earlier behaviors so that we can reinforce those as a way to prevent anyone from escalating to the point of that self-harm or being super aggressive, higher levels of behavior in the classroom. So those are some of the prevention antecedent things. That behavior problem. Again, thinking of our learner, what are their skills? What are they able to do, not able to do? That helps us determine what are some skills we're going to teach them. If we know we're going to teach Chris a different way of getting her needs met, can she say it verbally? If she can't, can she write it? Can she sign it? Can she use an iPad or a switch to help communicate? Can we teach her those ways of getting her needs met? We also want to think about, especially for escape maintain behaviors, not only do I want Chris to say, I need a break, I also want to break down that task so that Chris has the skills to perform that task. Because if Chris is always getting out of math, and all we've ever taught her is teaching her is say, I need a break, I need a break, I need a break, she's never going to learn the math facts again, if that really is what she's able to do, she'll never learn those. So we want to make sure we back up the academics to a level where I can be successful, so that we're not leaving holes in my math skills. At the same time, we are teaching that alternative communication. And then we also need to explicitly teach our rules and expectations. For example, my turn to talk versus your turn to talk. It's not bad to talk, but here's when you talk, here's when I talk. And then consequences. Again, not discipline, just what typically follows the behavior. We want to make sure that the consequences for practicing your skills, the skills for communicating in a different manner, get a bigger response than the problem behavior. So how do we adjust that? If we can't flat out ignore the behavior, not ignore the person, not respond to the behavior, how can we make that different? How can we make sure that when you're doing well, you get the larger response from me? And when you're struggling, maybe you get a neutral response, or you get a reminder of what to do instead. Again, for reinforcement, how do we tap into, is it immediate? Is it preferred? Is it just the right amount of effort to access that reinforcer? And are we doing it often enough that true learning is happening? And then we can fade out that rate of reinforcement. Elizabeth, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that I do is, I'll figure that out after I tell my comment here. One thing that I do is I teach a lot of kids that with English classes that have a lot of trauma with English. So, for example, I have a young lady right now that when she came to me, I told her, we're going to be reading Julius Caesar. We're going to read Tale of Two Cities. And she goes, I can't read those. And I go, sure you can. We're going to read the graphic novels of them. Well, another part of that is the last 20 minutes of my classes is always, all right, you worked. All right, who's playing Uno? Who's playing Skippo? What are we going to play today? And so we turn it into like this very positive, like, we're going to have fun in English too, if that makes sense. And I've gotten really good responses from my students just doing that.
That is awesome. What you're creating is a very nurturing environment. So they know, even though you're going to ask them to do some hard stuff, you got this. I'm going to be there with you. And this is still fun. Because I think sometimes we forget that if the host environment isn't something I like or feel comfortable in, I'm going to really not care if the consequence is you remove me from your room. But if your room is so nurturing and you're adjusting the academics to a level I feel I can be successful at, and there's fun stuff at the end, if for some reason you did have to remove me, even temporarily, I want back in there because I know you care and you've adjusted it so that I can be successful. And as I think back to my previous training, when we think of some of the institutions, what went wrong with those really were, we removed a lot of great stimulation. They didn't have games. They didn't have enough people teaching skills. And so it wasn't effective. There was a lot of things that went wrong with the institutions. But behaviorally, what went wrong is if someone ripped something down, we didn't put anything back up. We didn't have money to fix things. We didn't train people. When the environment is rich and I feel supported and I get my needs met, I want to be there. And so we need to make sure, what are we doing to make sure that those pieces are in that environment, regardless if I have a disability or not. This needs to be someplace that I feel comfortable and supported. So as I look at, I'm going to try to summarize because I have some examples that we can problem solve and talk about. Some of our common triggers for significant behavior problems, for self-interest behavior. Again, we need to rule out medical. Is there a reason why I'm doing this? Is it because I have an earache? If I'm doing it here, is it I have a toothache? If I'm really doing something to my nose, is there something in my nasal cavity? If I'm doing it to my forehead, is it, sinus pressure? I've had individuals who their self-interest behavior, or maybe it wasn't was related to the last time they had a bowel movement. And so we get creative. How are we going to collect data to see if that really is related to the self-interest behavior? We also want to make sure we are creating enriched environments. No one can be successful when it's a pretty sterile environment. I mean, we really want to be enriched environment with activities and interactions that are supportive. If other common triggers include transitions. In schools, there are transitions that are quick. Oh, I lost track of time. Put away your books. Let's line up. Time to go to music. There's also slow transitions. When you're done with this worksheet, turn it into the basket, then please take out a library book. And when everyone's done, then we'll meet at the carpet. So trying to teach the difference in types of transitions is very important. And then for some people, changes in routine. And that change in routine could be, you're not my usual person who works with me, whether that you're a substitute para, substitute teacher, or whoever that might be, that you're just not the same and you're doing it slightly different. I'm not okay with different. I'm used to routine and schedule. So that could be a common antecedent. Other factors that impact the self-interest behavior, again, can be medical. We want to rule that out to ensure that we're not trying to do a behavior plan when it really needs to be a medical intervention. Some common strategies that are very, very effective or can be: connect with the person. Know what their skills are. Know what they like. What are their interests? In some cases, that means we have to be a little bit of a detective to find out what are their interests, what are their wants and needs, how do they communicate, do they have the skill to do whatever we're asking them to do. We might need to break down some of our requests into just smaller little pieces, because they can do it, but they might just need it broken down into more digestible chunks. We might need to provide choices either within the activity. So it's still the same worksheet I need to do, but I have a choice. Do I want to do it by myself or with help? Do I want to do it with this pencil or the mechanical pencil? Or do I want the other pencil? Do I want to do it at this location? Or maybe I have a remote office at a table in the back. So giving some choice. Or is there a way to demonstrate that skill by providing choices between activities? Do you want to do this one or this one? Those can be some nice ways to help de-escalate. And we all feel better when we have some say in what we're doing. Some common tools that are used, again, looking at maybe completing a functional behavior assessment to look at how does the environment impact my behavior, my skills. Not necessarily, the weather, although sometimes the weather impacts it, but we are part of the environment too. So is Chris maybe too wordy? Or, for example, I've been known, I like to give people pats on the back as I walk by to kind of say, I see you, you're doing really great. Some people don't like that. And so I'll ask them, is it okay if I do that? And you said, no, I'm going to work really hard at not doing that. But if I mess up, I'm gonna work really hard to remember you don't like to be touched. If I mess up and I give you a pat on the back, can you remind me? And I'll do my best to avoid that. So that might be another way to do that. Krista, you have a great question. Is there recent literature on that intersection between mental health, intellectual developmental disabilities, and self-interest behavior? The literature I follow really well is more of the behavioral psychology, and that usually sometimes it taps into the mental health piece as well, but usually focuses on more of that in the moment behavior analysis. Now, depending on the student or the person's skill set, we might start thinking about more verbal behavior types of interventions rather than just what most people think of as behavior interventions, where it's tokens or just direct reinforcement of skills and teaching skills. Sometimes we can tap into some of that verbal behavior counseling or behavior therapy, those types of things. And then other tools that we can use besides just a functional behavior assessment might be things such as an ecological assessment. And there's some information or resources out on structured ecological assessment tool. In schools, we may also look at, for example, a classroom assessment tool to identify some important things that tend to be related to problem behaviors. So, okay, this is the summary. I have 3 different vignettes that we could talk about. The first one, see if I can find it. The first example or case study would be